Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about the very sad events in Washington, D.C., where this Jewish couple were murdered. We talk a little bit about these kind of apparently politically motivated murders. After all, the person who killed them screamed Free Palestine after the act was done. But we press into some of what's going on. We think about collective guilt. We think about the sense of deep-seated injustice that's widely recognized around the world, and the need for somebody or something to pay. I know this is heavy going, but I think this will be helpful to you as you consider some of these dark current events that are nevertheless part of our world. Of course, we want to leave you with robust Christian hope in the end. As always, thank you so much for following us. If you find us helpful, you find value in the work that we do, you can support us by going to www.toltogether.com, click the donate page. Also, like, subscribe, and spread the word about us.
Cameron, story that everybody's heard. We're referring to last week's shooting outside Israeli Embassy Museum of Jewish History. A young man from Chicago who shot two young Jewish people yelling "Free Palestine." And so obviously deep political commentary and ramifications on this from all sorts of directions, and some of it helpful and some of it not. But there's an element inside this that so there's maybe a nod back to a Luigi moment here with United Healthcare assassination murder that plays to an interesting idea that has been a sticking point theologically for a lot of people who, first of all, I think deeply misunderstand the idea of the atonement and the idea like how can somebody be punished for somebody else's sins or somebody else's grievance. So that kind of scapegoating, we're going to isolate out an individual and make them suffer for the sake of something else. And people are like, that's ridiculous. Nobody believes in that kind of thing. Yeah, except for all of these examples where you do have two people
Yeah.
who were killed because they were Jewish by somebody yelling "Free Palestine," as if those two people in Washington, D.C. were responsible for what's happening in Gaza, and
Mm-hmm.
calculate it even out further what you think about the morality of all that's going on there. That's a whole separate story. Um, Same thing. You don't like a healthcare company, you shoot the CEO, and on it goes. You can look at. I think another one of these that's fascinating for me is the time in which you'll have a massive failure of an employee, and the CEO or a leader of the company steps down as a result of that.
Mm.
Even those you can say, like, well, they should have been responsible. The degree to which we can hold somebody else responsible for somebody else's more our perception of somebody else's moral decisions, um, and the way in which I look at the world, there's not a very tight link there at all. But it is there is a way here in which we do cause people to suffer for their association with things that we don't like, and we feel like taking it out on that individual somehow hurts the overall movement that we oppose. What are some of the threads or ideas here that make that work, or how does a person get to that point philosophically, I guess? Um, and what are we to make of that?
I mean, I think a thinker who has come to real prominence once again is René Girard, and that name will be familiar to some, French cultural theorist, but he has done a lot to show us that what we thought we tend to think of scapegoating and, collective guilt. We think of these things as part of an ancient civilization, perhaps. Maybe you've even read, the book of Leviticus or something like that, but he
Or
has done.
or a more modern example, so a pastor in Florida burns a Quran and then 20 people get shot in Afghanistan. Something like that.
Well, he's done so what's clear is that this has not gone away. We haven't outgrown this behavior, and it's actually quite routine. So let me give you a couple of other very routine examples. You think of a scandal like Abu Ghraib. I'm not probably pronouncing that correctly, but when you had soldiers who were, the scandal that involved soldiers torturing, you know, prisoners and things like that.
Mhm.
So something like that happens, and then when you put on a uniform, a soldier's uniform, you are an ambassador for an entire institution. And so that will cast a dark light on soldiers for many people, or instances of police brutality. I think one of the clearest examples for me was the Ferguson riots, which centered on Michael Brown, and then but you had, of course, this community, and there was a legacy of racism and police brutality, but then there was a very specific case, and the facts on the ground, it quickly became apparent, didn't matter to many people because this police officer, regardless of whether he was technically performing the right action or not, he was already guilty in the eyes of that community because he became at that point not just scapegoat, a symbol of all
Mhm.
of that injustice. And so
So
that you
I think this
yeah,
is what you're pointing out. The symbol word is going to be very important in this conversation, I believe.
very important. So because obviously when you're talking about matters of life and death, which we are right now, the facts on the ground matter. You've got to, at a certain point, all rich symbolism aside, human beings are losing their lives. So what actually happened? I was actually I remember talking about this, Nathan, at one point in a particular online forum and saying, well, actually, here are the facts that have come to light. Somebody was very outraged and was, very angry about police brutality and talking about the legacy of police brutality and racism. But I said, yeah, but here the facts clearly demonstrate that the narrative against this particular police officer is a false one. He was actually acting in self-defense. And about 3 or 4 people, Nathan, different people, kind of said to me, Cameron, what you're saying right now is completely inappropriate. This person's feelings matter, and they've been deeply hurt by everything that they've just mentioned. This is not the place for facts, basically. And I'm trying not to put words in I don't remember the
Mhm.
precise phraseology, but that's essentially what was being said to me. And I did think, "Oh my,
Ah,
that's not." I mean, now we're in some pretty interesting territory if the symbolism here. Now, I'm not saying that they would, I'm not trying to insert words in anybody's mouth and say that they wouldn't, people are losing their lives and they would say that symbolism overrides the actual truth. But in a
man,
sense,
yeah.
that's kind of what they were saying. Yeah, so that's a dynamic that emerges when we have this conversation about collective guilt, somebody being an ambassador for an entire group. It's easy to point to institutions like the military or the police force, or politicians are like this for many of us, right? A lot of people will think,
Mhm.
"Oh, yeah, the government." So the government now, there's widespread cynicism, and there's a belief that it's all corrupt and all of that. So if you are a person who works in politics, you're necessarily sort of painted with that brush. So we all do this to an extent. There may be sort of a somewhat inevitable feature to this, but you can carry it drastically too far as well.
So, I mean, there are two parts to this. So, one is you're identifying individuals with a whole cause. The other one is the reverse of that, where you as an individual feel like you get to advocate for and speak for a whole cause. So, if you look at this case that we're discussing here, you have a Rodriguez from Chicago shooting Jewish people on behalf of the Palestinians. As
Mhm.
far as I know, if I can make some general assumptions here, Rodriguez isn't like a historically Palestinian name, and Chicago isn't, so there's a sense here of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
this isn't somebody from Palestinian heritage doing this. This is
Mhm.
somebody who is choosing to identify with a group and acting on their behalf. And so in the other direction, so it's individual to group to individual identification, the symbolism and the degree to which we're willing to um, self-identify with, I guess, is that what's happening here? Um,
Well,
to
so
make a
part of
statement?
what this sparks huge conversations for a lot of people who don't if you don't have a theological framework, this all looks really complicated, I guess, in some sense. If you have a theological framework, there is, in some ways, it's very straightforward. Murder is wrong. You're killing somebody. If it's a cultural framework where God is largely absent, where you're thinking really in secular terms by default, these are politically motivated murders. So that puts them in a different category than, say, somebody who is simply taking life because it for the thrill, or somebody who's, you think about if it's a case of domestic violence, or if it's somebody who is a serial murderer or something. This is these people have a purpose, or appear to have a purpose, or want us to think that they have a purpose behind their actions. So Luigi Mangione, I actually don't think Luigi Mangione is really that interesting, to be honest with you. He certainly is, I mean, he's got an interesting background, I suppose, and he's, well educated and all of that. But I don't see a very profound person when I look at him. I mean, and I so I'm trying to choose my words carefully here.
You're saying that we have a capacity to layer philosophical
Romanticize.
romanticize and layer philosophical sophistication on stupidity.
I
Insane.
think so. Yes. So basically, I wanna just baldly state these actions are the very height of folly. They're stupid, but also a word like stupid runs the risk of trivializing. They're also heinous. You've killed people. You have taken life. And for what?
Well,
For
to
some
show that taking
pol
life is wrong.
to show that taking life is wrong. So again, if you state it in these terms, the foolishness of this, I think, becomes apparent. Will this now? Some people might say, "Well, no, this is highlighting injustice, and this will bring attention. This will bring a blinding spotlight to the issue in the way, and that will, shatter people's passivity and shake them out of their stupor." I don't buy
I doubt it.
any of that. I buy none of that. I'm not even remotely convinced of any of that. I think this is horrific. I'm actually I like what our friend Abdu Murray had said about this. His kind of quick take, which, look up Abdu Murray. You should try to. We could maybe try to link to this, but just look up. I mean, basically, he said this is cancel culture ramping up to assassination culture, and he calls it the Luigi Mangione effect.
Yeah, but
But
hang on. There's a difference here that so in the past, when you think of assassination, you think Archduke somebody is
yeah, sure,
assassinated, it kicks off something like, okay, a healthcare executive, two people working on like interfaith relations and Gaza. Like nobody heard of I don't say nobody, but like these are not
sure.
massive political
It's
figures
not
that are being,
it's not Franz Ferdinand. Yeah, right.
yeah. So that's another part of this is like the symbolism is lost on me. I get it, but it's just trying to inhabit the thinking of somebody who's doing this. Like that's not how I would
Yeah.
go about. Like, but maybe I'm not
What
crazy,
I
so that's why I can't picture it.
No, I mean, my takeaway from this is actually darker. It's not that. So I think there is, as horrible as a politically motivated crime would be, or politically motivated act of terrorism like this, it's somewhat comforting to say that no, there's a deep and profound motivation behind this, but I actually don't think there is. I think this is more indicative of a deep-seated cultural nihilism. And so a loss of any sense of a shared understanding of why we're here, and that there's a deeper meaning to life. I think these are instances of people lashing out. And I think it is surprising that we don't see more of this kind of thing. I do think
Mhm.
we will see a little bit more of this kind of thing. I mean, there are always levels of restraint, but I think this is part of what happens when you have a meaning crisis and people have lost any sense of a coherent narrative, and you start to see these kinds of breakdowns.
Do you think it's uniquely difficult for us in a I guess at the root of the struggle that we have here is that we do live in a time of a deep sense of individualism. And if you think about collective identity historically, we can look Old Testament. David sends X many thousands of people die. The leader messes up a lot. There are a lot of deaths. Um, and so there is kind of the this for that sort of collective glory, guilt, bargaining, destruction, but all the way up through. I mean, I'm from West Virginia. We have the famous Hatfields and McCoys. Basically, you just shot people who had
Yeah,
the a different last name than you. Like it's more complex than that, but you get these
yeah,
feuds where being part of a clan or a tribe or a
yeah,
um I think that's one of the things that doesn't translate well back and forth between America and the Middle East is that I remember thinking, like, talking to somebody and they, as a Middle Easterner in a country where the government controls almost everything, would look at a TV show like Friends and be like, "Oh, that's what Christianity is about." Because
Yeah.
America is a Christian nation and Friends is a show that is endorsed by that nation. So therefore, Friends are what Christians are like. Clearly, this is immoral. We got to
Mhm.
take them out to glorify Allah.
Yep.
The ways in which we picture how other groups are connected to ideologies and bigger groups or see themselves as individuals. I'll tell you the exact opposite story of what that would look like. So a couple years ago, I was coming back from the airport like 1:30 in the morning, long straight stretch, and I was middle of nowhere through the woods, and I went past a cop who was sitting in the trees, and I was like, I was going pretty fast. I mean, not too fast, but and he didn't follow me, and I was like, something else is going on here. So I went like another mile and a half, came around a turn, and there were like 7 or 8 cop cars all over the road. And I was like, wow, I was going fast, but not that fast. That's, interesting. What's going on here? And so as I pull up, there's this white dude all tatted up, like they have him folded over the hood of a sports car, and there are police officers everywhere, and they're like waving me through. And I didn't think like, oh look, the police are beating up this white dude at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of nowhere. I was like, well, don't do drugs, and kept on going. Like
Yeah.
I had no communal cultural affiliation or like, hey, they're roughing up my people kind of thing. And so part of it, like, is that that way of thinking of the individual is suffering for their individual decisions, not, um, oh, I need to check in on this. So it's like when we inhabit a hyper individualistic framework like that. Now, I do have people that I would consider to be part of my community, but it doesn't have to do with what color their skin is. Um, I have my allegiances are aligned in different ways there, but it was just fascinating to me to think like I didn't really think anything of it other than processing it as an individual.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on I mean, there are so many different factors to that conversation there. I mean, people who have been in historically disadvantaged and or marginalized communities do tend to have a deeper sense of solidarity, I find. Tim Keller used to talk about one of his African American classmates in seminary saying the problem with white people is that you don't think you have a culture. You just assume this is the way everybody is, and but there are other ways of doing it. So those who have yeah who have experienced a sort of
So let me say, I know. So anticipating where you're going, let me say this. So yes to that, and I would imagine that Palestinians might feel that way. What we're talking about a Rodriguez from Chicago.
yeah. Well,
That's the leap.
yeah, and that was just a different conversation there, but I mean, it is obviously it's related to this, but yeah, so back to Rodriguez. So here's my dark take on this, and I could well be wrong. I mean, that's the nature of talking about current events. So I want to exercise my right to get things wrong right here.
More details will come out, I'm sure.
Because, well, I'm sure plenty of people could play devil's advocate and say, "Look, I completely disagree with this man's heinous actions, but clearly he was willing to be arrested. He was. It certainly looks like he was acting out of principle." I don't think that. And what what I see when I see a Luigi Mangione or when I see a Rodriguez or I see people similar instances like this, what I see are people desperate to bring about some form of very morbid self-expression. And I
Mm,
do see that as an outworking of extreme individualism deprived of real meaning. I do see it in those terms. So I see these kinds of stunts as much more about Rodriguez, much more about Mangione than any vaunted cause. So do I think Luigi Mangione is doing this on behalf of all the downtrodden who are being crushed economically and who are powerless and voiceless? Absolutely not. I don't think that at all. I think that's giving way too much credit. Do I think that Rodriguez was acting out of some high moral principle for the people of Palestine? I'm sorry, I don't think he was. Now, do I have access to his heart? I don't. But I think what I'm seeing, just based on just purely the events that unfold here, I'm seeing desperate individuals lashing out who want attention,
Yeah,
and they're
no, so
getting a lot of it. Yeah.
well, but so to me, this is the weird part of this, Cameron, is that it appears to be communal, but it is deeply individualistic, and you're basically using somebody else's suffering to create meaning in your own life, and I'm sure that feels like an uneasy alliance and tension, and so the
But I think that's
how could
exactly
you
the same.
prove you're so in other than running it to its logical, craziest, most heinous
I think that's
form?
exactly this is the dark side of virtue signaling. And I think so often when you express outrage publicly without doing probably, I mean, with doing, at the very least, most people who express outrage publicly, it comes at very low cost to do so on social media, right?
Mhm.
You're in all of, I mean, there have been a lot of studies conducted on this. This was highlighted in the book We've Never Been Woke by Musa Al-Gharbi, but he looks at, he cites all of these incredibly damning studies that look at basically academics and, white collar people who are, liberal, progressive, not all of them, but many of them, in those tend in that direction, and they are very vocal about all of these issues. But when you look at their actual lives, when you look at their spending, they're not donating money for the most part. They're not doing anything other than being very loud about it on social media. So that tells me that part of the takeaway there has to be that this is very much about not just self-expression, but making sure that you're in with the right people, that this is a career move for many people, especially in the academic world. Musa Al-Gharbi kind of is pointing out that a lot of academics, during a period where you want to be seen as on the right side of all these issues and on the right side of history, it really pays, literally, to express that publicly and make sure that that's part of your brand. I'm aware of how cynical this all sounds, but I think when you actually look into the facts, you get a really cynical story on this stuff, and a very, very sad story, because sometimes people take it really far and kill somebody, and people lose their lives.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think the reason these well, let me just put one angle or element on this is that you know what the opposite of metaphysical is? Blood.
Right.
And so there's a way in which there's some wild ideas, but what struck me as interesting, if their initial reports are true, and I don't know if you saw this side of it or not, Cameron. So this guy shoots this couple, and then goes staggering into a museum, and he comes in looking like, and so people run over to comfort him because clearly something is wrong with him. He's shaking. They're trying to console him, and all of a sudden realize, wait a second, what's wrong with this guy? Is he just killed two people? Um,
Mm.
but it killing somebody or killing anything does not give you this triumphalistic. It almost sounds like he was in as much shock as he himself was. I think having and will for the rest of his life have to come to grips with what he convinced himself to do, and then recognize, man,
You know,
this was real life and death. I almost
th
wonder if there's an inability to connect with reality in such a way that
oh, yeah,
y-
there has to be. No, there has to, for the most part, there has to be. I mean, there are some people who do very consciously and carefully and thoughtfully take human life, and we don't really have. I mean, we can throw around categories like psychopath or sociopath, but in some ways, this is just us trying to dress up very mysterious behavior with formal language. Now, I'm not denying, clinical psychology, but I'm just. I mean, I just not too long ago read the full account of the Columbine massacre, and the one, especially, I mean, the profile of the one killer, Eric Harris, was that, yes, he's classic psychopath, and what you say something like classic psychopath, it makes it sound like, oh yeah, we have a whole, deep understanding of this profile, and as though this somehow, no, I'm not, yeah, explains
well,
that
a
a
lot of
teenage,
psychopaths don't kill people.
yeah, right, that a teenage boy went to all of this trouble and went to all of these lengths to take life and wanted to kill more people. There's something very just deeply strange about it. But also, this is why some people who just look at life under the sun without reference to God can say that life is deeply tragic, because that, so yeah, that guy, Is there a way he fully understood what he was doing? There's no way he possibly could have. I mean, he
Mhm.
unleashed events that are totally irreversible, but it doesn't matter that he didn't fully understand. He is now fully accountable for the disproportionate damage that he just unleashed, and 2 people have been taken away from this world forever. They can never be returned. And yeah, did he know what he was getting into? I mean, there's a sense in which this is also why Karl Barth called sin the impossible possibility. You really start to think about this. You see how deeply strange and so it is that we have the kind of freedom to where we can do something that terrible that we can't even wrap our heads around. But we've done it
Hmm.
and it's happened and there's no changing it now. And you said it. He's gonna spend the rest of his life trying to wrap his head around what he did. He did.
Hmm. It is one of the horrible and awesome responsibilities of being human. The level of destruction that we're capable of is astounding, and I think it's the common grace of God that, like you said, that we don't see. I mean,
See more
our
of it, yeah.
capacity our capacity for destruction is phenomenal, and our capacity for the production of great good and beauty, um,
Absolutely, yeah.
by the work of the Lord is good too. But here's the thing, Cameron, to develop something good, wholesome, rich, beautiful takes a lot of time. To kill or destroy takes almost no time.
Yep.
And so it's a disproportionate, the temporal elements of our capacity for brokenness are a wild part of what it means to be human that we don't always get to slow down and think through.
So the final piece we need to talk about here in closing is really the theological piece. There is widespread recognition that something is deeply wrong with human beings, and not just wrong in the sense that we're victims, but that grave wrong has been done by human beings, and somebody has to pay.
Mhm.
That's been true down the ages, and you can look into the past, you could see the most elaborate of sacrificial systems that are in place in many ancient civilizations, and more now people, good sociologists and good anthropologists will instead of just being dismissive and say, "Oh, it's just primitive savagery," they'll say, "Oh, no, the level of careful thought and sophistication that went into this system, we would recognize this as a human rights crisis, but nevertheless, this was in place to ensure that order is maintained in society, that violence is kept at bay." There's a widespread recognition in a lot of just ancient cultures that unless you have some sort of sacrificial system in place with some sort of scapegoat mechanism, violence is this unending cycle. It'll never stop. People will keep killing each other because their last names. There's nothing. Something has to stand in and stop the cycle.
Yeah. Two things on that real quick. There's Gandhi got this one wrong. Maybe you've seen it as a bumper sticker. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind.
Mm,
No, that's not true. An eye
yep.
for an eye leaves two people without one eye.
Hmm.
And if you go back and look at that lex talionis structure in the Old
Yep.
Testament, it also wasn't the individual who was injured who exacted the punishment. The community did it.
Right.
And so I mean, that's still a wild concept,
Because
but because the individual,
yep.
like, think of it as a little kid. My brother hits me once, I hit him twice.
Yep.
One for thinking about it and once for doing it. Well, then I hit him twice. How many times does he have to hit me for the
Yep.
extra
Yep.
punch? That's that's the perpetual cycle. And the challenging thing here is, so there's the communal nature of the need here, but the other thing is, you said we see these things in the world and we know that somebody has to pay. But the weird thing is that we all deep down know that most of these things aren't things that a human can pay for. Like,
We
we're outside
absolutely
of
know
our
that.
economy of what's possible. So, like, what? So this guy shoots two people. If the state got together and said, okay, and now we're going to go shoot two of his family members, that doesn't bring anybody back to life. It doesn't balance any moral scale. It might make a couple people temporarily feel better, but we use the phrase "justice was served" way too flippantly. I mean,
We do.
there's a sense in
The
which we legally have standards that we can live up to, but to think that, oh, this person ran over this person with a car and killed them, and then they were awarded $2 million, justice was served. What we're up against, Cameron,
yeah.
is how do we provide earthly justice for the violation of things that are divinely declared to be sacred? And so if
Yeah,
you
and
see a human life is sacred,
yeah,
then humans aren't going to be able to atone for that on our own in any meaningful way.
totally impossible. And you run into this also when you have conversations around something like racial reparations or any kind of, how can we make right some heinous atrocity of the past? Well, there are measures that can be taken, of course, but you can't make it right. That's impossible on human terms. And so when you come there, you're grasping, you're grasping a little bit the need for some kind of a perfect sacrifice. As crude as it sounds to modern, I hear it all the time, Nathan. Yeah, so we have to, God had to kill his son just so he could appease his own wrath for us. How disgusting and despicable is that? Really? Well, if you press into human affairs and you look at the widespread responses to injustice and these lashings out, and you see this recognition that somebody has to pay, it certainly seems to be the case that most of us think it makes some kind of sense.
Well,
That some
and
sort of, yeah, of
we don't believe just in the sacrifice, we also believe in the resurrection. And so the
course, yeah.
capacity for redemption and renewal and recreation and restoration in that sense is also a massive part of, if we're going to play with a full deck of Christian cards here, we have to look at the whole story, which is to say that not only I love that line in First Peter 2 when it talks about Jesus leaving us an example when he suffered that we should suffer in this way. Goes on a little bit and like First Peter 2:23 in there it says he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And so there is a sense in which Jesus is, and Christians to a certain extent do outsource final justice to say God will be able to handle and make this right in the end, even when we're in a position where we can't do it ourselves. There is a
Mhm.
peace in thinking that, and a terror, I think, in knowing that
Yes.
one day we will all give an account before God, even for every word we have spoken. And in that time, I'm going to be thrilled that it's not a human judge who has to sort that all out because God is
Amen.
just. That's the story of
Yeah.
Scripture. God is also merciful.
Merciful.
Also the
Yeah.
story of Scripture. And so I think it's really, Cameron, you're hopefully helping us dive down into this when you look at the complexity of how humans actually behave and the systemic problems of sin and brokenness that we can sense. It is not crazy when Christians come to a place of saying, actually, there's good news here, that there's help from the outside and helping us bring all of this to a perfect conclusion in the end.
So much more could be said, and I'm afraid we've only scratched the surface, but we want to get you thinking. That's the goal. So thanks for tuning in and listening with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.